who I used to work for when I was an undergrad. But like Brooke said, now I'm in the Department of Ag Education and Communication. I'm a program coordinator for the Wedgworth Leadership Institute. And like Brooke said, the program's been around for about 30 years. Every 2 years, we bring in a cohort of 30 folks who are leaders in Florida agriculture and natural resources. And we spend those 2 years with them developing their leadership skills so that they can do a better job for Florida and our A&R policy specifically. And so these are just some fun pictures. The capstone experience for our cohort is an international trip. So in June 2021, 2022, I can't remember, we went abroad for 2 weeks to Portugal and Morocco. And so it's a pretty fun job sometimes when you're in Portugal at the most beautiful vineyard you've ever been to, and they are just shoving more and more wine into your hand. And you're like, this is leadership, like we're learning or something like that. And so to bring it back to the topic of conflict management, this is a presentation that we do with our cohort of leaders because conflict management is so important no matter where you are in the organization. And being a group of graduate students and postdocs, of course, you encounter conflict peer-to-peer with people you work with, and you also have a unique experience of encountering conflict with your supervisor. And of course, we'll talk about this more later, but the power dynamic between you and your supervisor is going to affect a lot of how you manage that conflict. So that's why we want to talk about this today. And there we go. And in our time together, you'll discover how you handle conflict. You'll discover the 5 styles for handling conflict. And by increasing the awareness of how you handle conflict and how people around you handle conflict, you'll be better able to use other conflict management styles to deal with problems. So, a quick question to start us off. I know everyone's eating, but think about this just for a second. Finish the sentence. When I see conflict coming, I do what? If I were to answer this question, I would say when I see conflict coming, I run and hide, I want to melt into the wall, and I will avoid it at all costs. So what about you? What do you do when you see conflict coming? I prepare. You prepare? What does that mean? Tell me more. You get your people on your same page. You're like, look, this is about to happen. Alexander, Brooks, I need backup. That's better than what I do, running and hiding, right? Who else will share what they do when they see conflict coming? Especially here at work, right? It's a safe space. Yeah, that's the thing. I just don't want to deal with the negative feelings of conflict. So that's why I run and hide. But I know logically that that is not the way I should be dealing with conflict, because then it's only going to get worse and it's only going to fester, and I'm going to be bothered by this anxiety for not having dealt with the conflict. And especially in leadership development, we know that's not how we should be dealing with conflict. So some folks conducted research about how does conflict make you feel? And it's no surprise that most people would say they're demotivated. It's a distraction. You've got a group of people down here that say nervous, sick to my stomach. I would definitely qualify as that, sleepless and stressed. But then you have these freaks at the bottom of the chart, freaks in my opinion. They are excited and think of conflict as a chance to prove yourself, or it makes them energized. It's the spice of life. And maybe that's you, Brooks, or something. Like Brooks and I are very different. You'll come to learn, but which makes our marriage very interesting. But it's like confident, the issues have been aired. Like there are people out there that feel that way. I am not one of those people, and maybe you are. And that's why we have to have this conversation, right? To bring language and bring awareness to the different ways that people deal with conflict. And then once we're able to wrap our heads around that and have common language to discuss it, it's way easier to have dialogue about conflict and ultimately resolve that conflict. And it'll also be no surprise to you that when they asked folks, what are the main causes of conflict in your workplace? Number 1, poor communication. Number 2, lack of clarity. Of course, that makes sense. And poor communication and lack of clarity go right hand in hand, right? And then, of course, heavy workloads or personality clashes. It's kind of like family, right? Like you don't pick your family and you just have to deal with them at work. You don't pick your coworkers. And so you're going to have those personality clashes. Changes in policies or organizational structures. I'm sure you guys are familiar with UFGO and what a joy it has been to transition our travel management system to UFGO. And there has certainly been some conflict between the folks that arrange our travel and folks that are trying to travel and dealing with that. And that's chalk it up to a change in policy, change in org structure. So all these things cause conflict in our workplace. We could do a whole nother presentation, a whole nother slide about conflict within your family. That's a totally different issue, but that's just at work. And so for the purposes of our discussion, to give us a common definition of conflict, we'll say that conflict is any situation in which the concerns of two people appear to be incompatible. And what stands out to me about this definition are the words appear and incompatible. And so, what I like about this definition is it takes all of the emotion out of our problems with conflict, right? When I described my reaction to conflict earlier, it's very emotional based because I'm scared and I'm anxious and I'm worried about impending conflict. But if you were to remove the emotion from that, it's just that two people think that we are at a crossroads and it appears there's incompatibility. But if we can both buck up and actually have a discussion about the conflict, you might be surprised that the things in the situation aren't actually incompatible. And so let's remove all the emotion, take all the power away from the negative connotation of conflict by just remembering it's a situation where our concerns appear to be incompatible. And so here's the fun part of this exercise. These folks that research conflict professionally developed the Thomas Kilmann instrument, or the TKI, and it is essentially a gigantic BuzzFeed quiz that will tell you how you handle conflict. And it's, more than 7 million copies of it. It's the world's leading measure of conflict handling behavior. It's all backed by research. So when you do something like the TKI, you take this quiz, so to speak, that tells you your conflict management style. Like I said earlier, it's just giving us common language to discuss these things, which makes it a lot easier to deal with. And by doing that, you can learn to assess a conflict situation. You can learn about these other conflict handling styles that aren't your preferred conflict handling styles, but they might be better conflict handling styles. And so you can develop better strategies to assess conflict. And the way they describe this is just like anything in life, it's a habit. We go with our gut reactions. And so when we're able to learn new strategies, it might take a little bit of time, but eventually we'll be able to apply what we've learned about all these other conflict handling styles instead of just resulting to our default. So in a moment, we'll scan a QR code and everyone can take the TKI, but I just want to preface this before we get going. It'll take us all about 10 minutes to do it on our phones. It's just a Qualtrics assessment I've built. You'll receive 30 paired statements, and the instructions are this. Consider situations in which you find your wishes differ from those of another person. How do you usually respond to the situation? Select the statement which is most characteristic of your own behavior in the workplace. In many cases, neither statement may be very typical of your behavior, but please select the response which you would be more likely to use. For example, in a conflict situation at work, would you say, I'm usually firm in preferring my goals, or I might try to soothe others' feelings and preserve our relationship? Also, in a conflict situation at work, would you say, I try to find compromise to solutions, or sometimes I sacrifice my own wishes for the wishes of the other person? And I've highlighted behavior in the workplace for a very specific reason, because you could take this test fully thinking about the way you deal with conflict at work and get one result, and then you could take it again, the exact same test, thinking about how you deal with conflict in your personal life and with your family, and get a completely different result. And Brooks can tell you that, like, at work, I'm much more likely to defer to somebody else, cower for my superior. But if it's the two of us and we're arguing about what to have for dinner, I'm not going to accommodate and I'm not going to avoid. Like, I'm going to compete because I want to go to Chili's for dinner or whatever it is. So just think about work. And because, once again, power dynamics as graduate students and postdocs, we might be one level down on the org chart, and that's going to affect how you treat your superiors, how you treat the undergraduates that work for you. So think about that conflict in the workplace specifically. And once again, remember that neither statement may be very typical of your behavior, but select the response which you would be more likely to use. And so using a phone or a laptop, if you scan this QR code, it should take you to a Qualtrics assessment. And once again, once you get it loaded, you are free to start working on it. And we'll spend about the next 10 minutes or so doing that. If you need more time to go through the assessment, would you raise your hand? Take another minute. Let's talk through the results. So just for fun, who had their highest score as avoiding? Me too, me too. Who had their highest score as accommodating? Makes sense. Compromising? Collaborating? Cool, cool. And competing? All right. So we have somebody to represent every group. That's so awesome. And so when we think about approaches to conflict, the designers of this instrument plot those 5 things on 2 dimensions, an assertiveness dimension and a cooperativeness dimension. We can think of the assertiveness dimension as the extent to which I'm trying to satisfy my own needs. And then on the other hand, we can think of the cooperativeness dimension, the extent to which I'm trying to satisfy others' needs. And so all 5 conflict styles can be looked at as a combination of how much am I trying to advocate for myself here? How much am I willing to satisfy others' needs here? It's all those things falling on a spectrum somewhere. And so this is where we get the 5 conflict modes, and we will dive deeper into all of them in a second. And I'll have another QR code you can scan for a handout on each of the 5 modes that goes really in depth into how to use all of these modes. And so once again, we get competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, accommodating. And just a note about conflict that we would experience here in this workplace before we go on, cultural differences are going to have a big impact of our approach to conflict. And we know that working in a really multicultural workplace like this, we're going to see people who come from different places where conflict is handling differently. Now, I've only ever lived in the United States, so I can only speak to my experience that way, but I can tell you for sure that somebody from New York is going to handle conflict very differently and be much more likely to compete in a situation than the people that I know that live in the South here, who are going to be much more likely to avoid a conflict and then talk crap about you later behind your back. So that's just what happens within this country. And so we know that some people from other cultures are more assertive, less assertive, are more reverent to systems of hierarchy, whatever it is. So remember that that's really going to impact how we all deal with conflict together at this workplace. And then, like I mentioned before, it's really hard to compete sometimes when you feel like you're the most junior person on a team. So there's going to be a power dynamic between you and your PI, and you are always going to defer to them just a little bit more than a regular person because of that power dynamic and because they cut you a check. That just is what it is. So remember that when you're thinking about conflict. And so if you want to really quick scan this QR code or go to tinyurl.com/con style, and you'll get a handout of all of the conflict modes and how to use them, potential implications of overusing them, potential implications of underusing them, and then that way you don't have to worry about taking notes or missing anything here. So once again, if you missed it, it's tinyurl.com/con style. So to talk about our first style, competing, if I were to sum up the competing style in one sentence, I would just say, I know my way is the right way. And looking at this dimension, it's high assertiveness, low cooperativeness. So once again, that's high concern for self, low concern for others. I'm not looking to find a compromise. I'm looking to win in this situation. And I'm going to say this 10 more times before we're done. There are no bad ways to deal with conflict, only bad times to use those conflict styles, right? And so competing is not the worst style. I'm not here to tell you that if you're competing, you're bad and you should be trying to compromise more. But I will tell you there are times you should be competing and there are probably times you should not be competing. And so a pro of competing is that it's quick. We'll get it done quick. We'll get it done, when time is sparse, like we have to move. Competing, it can lead to creativity and innovation if there's healthy competition. That's going to depend a lot about the culture of your workplace. Is it a safe space to compete with the people around you? And are you surrounded by other creative minds that are not intimidating by competing? And it can help you avoid being taken advantage of. A con is that it can harm relationships and cause resentment. If you are always competing in every situation in the lab, nobody is going to want to work with you because you'll be viewed as uncooperative. And then it can lead to a hostile environment. And so my favorite example of a great way to use competing, especially in a lab environment like this, is when it comes to safety. I'm not going to compromise or collaborate with you about whether or not you need to be wearing gloves when you handle lithium bromide, or I'm not going to concede to your will when it comes to safety involving toxic chemicals in the fume hood. Like safety, you should always compete, because decisive action is required quickly. Next is avoiding. That's low concern for self and low concern for others. And if I were to sum up an avoiding in one sentence, I would say, not now, I'll come back to it tomorrow. You disengage from the conversation. And so the best way to use avoiding is because we do not have the information we need to make a decision right now. And so once again, to say that you've disengaged from the conflict sounds inherently bad, but if it's because we just can't make a decision today because we don't know XYZ, we have to postpone this to another time, that's a great reason to avoid conflict. And also, if a situation has just gotten really heated and we do not need to keep talking, it's going to allow us time for our emotions to cool down, and that can help us preserve those relationships by avoiding confrontation. A negative side of avoiding, same with competing, if you avoid constantly, nobody is going to want to work with you because you never get anything done. You're never making any decisions or dealing with anything. You're just always pushing it off to another time. And so we can only use the avoiding style when we have time to do so. We cannot avoid when quick, indecisive action is required. And of course, if you're always avoiding, you may look weak and indecisive, and that's really not how we want to appear in the workplace. Compromising. We're in the middle when it comes to our concern for self and our concern for others. And the best example is if you're bartering for something you're buying on Facebook Marketplace, like 200, 100, let's split the difference and say 150. But compromising, I think, is how we view the ideal conflict resolution, right? We can think of the Office scene where Michael Scott describes it as a win-win. And it's like, but no, there's an option called win-win-win. And it's true, though, because if you're thinking about you're halfway on the dimension for concern for self and you're halfway on the dimension for concern for others, then neither of your needs are being fully met. And so it's not the best way to resolve a solution necessarily, looking at the cons category. But a pro is that it can be really quick just to split the difference and move on. It can result in a mutually acceptable outcome where both parties receive some of their goals, and it can really help us maintain those tough relationships. But over time, it might just lead to mediocrity, right? We're not really pushing the envelope and getting where we could be. And of course, if we're not addressing the root cause of the conflict, we're just kicking the can down the road. We're going to have the same issue over and over again in the future. And so compromising is great when we're dealing with issues of low significance. So if we're having a conflict about where to go to lunch, like it really doesn't matter. Let's just compromise or even accommodate the other person in that situation. But so we don't want to spend too much time belaboring points that don't really matter. So in those situations, when you don't care, just compromise. It's fine. Accommodating. This is one of my favorite ones because it's what I like to do too. But if I were to sum up accommodating in a sentence, I would say, well, I think my idea was better, but I'm happy to go with whatever you think is best. Or, I just want you to be happy. Looking at assertiveness and cooperativeness, high concern for others' needs, low concern for my own needs. In this case, this person is saying that my relationship is more important than what I want here. And so that's the main pro, is that it preserves relationships by prioritizing the needs of the other party. This can create goodwill and fairness. People might really like to work with you if you're constantly accommodating because you're always giving them what they want. But we have to remember the flip side to that is that you're going to be seen as a pushover, and people are going to take advantage of you if you are always caving to their will and never advocating for your side of things. And I did this presentation for the Department of Environmental Protection, and I had a lawyer in the room, and her and I were talking after, and she said, as a lawyer who negotiates on behalf of the environment in Florida, I just can't see why I would ever accommodate. There's nothing in it for me. And I said, but there is something in it for you, because that social goodwill that you garner when you let someone else have their way, those are chips. That's social capital that you're accruing. And then eventually there's going to come a time when you need something from them. And I don't want to talk about it as manipulation, but it truly is how the world works. If you can say, hey, remember that time that I did XYZ for you, that I gave you XYZ, like now it's your time to get me back. And so for the lawyer, that made her understand why we could accommodate. It's because it helps us garner that social capital and grab up all that goodwill. Finally, collaborating. And so you notice that it is high on assertiveness, high on cooperative, win, win, win. So let's work together and come up with an even better solution. And an important thing to note about collaborating is that the culture of where you work really has to be an environment that encourages collaborating, because collaborating is best saved for when you're dealing with very big problems that require creative and innovative solutions that are going to take a lot of time. And so my favorite way to think about collaborating is, if you have a pie chart, we're not splitting it 50-50, we're actually expanding the size of the pie. And so the example people give when they talk about collaborating is a negotiation. If you're negotiating the minimum wage and somebody says it should be $8, somebody says it should be $7.50. Well, instead of just splitting the difference there and calling that a compromise, let's expand the size of the pie, and let's also start negotiating on, well, maybe if you can't give us a higher wage, could you give us more paid time off and or vacation days? Could you give us better working hours? Could you give us more breaks throughout the day? That kind of thing. So we move from focusing on the one issue at hand to, once again, expanding the size of the pie and talking about more. But we don't collaborate on things that don't matter. We don't collaborate on small issues like where to go to dinner or what brand of gloves we should order. You have to save collaborating for those really complicated tasks that require innovative and creative solution. And once again, it requires a high level of trust and cooperation between parties, which might not be present where you work if it's a more toxic workplace. And so you might not be able to collaborate then. And so what do we do with all of this now that you have a score, you know what your dominant style is? So what does that mean and why does it matter? Your dominant score, how you score highest on the test, is your preferred conflict mode. That's your habit. For whatever reason in your life and in your upbringing, that's just what you've reverted to at work. And so now that you are aware of how you revert to handling conflict, if you get into a conflict situation, you can say, wait, I'm accommodating right now because that's just my tendency, but I think I have a really good idea. So this is actually a better situation for me to compete because this really matters to me and it doesn't matter to the other person. So why would I accommodate them? That sort of thing. Now that we have language to describe these ways of handling conflict, which we all always inherently knew, but probably just didn't have the words to describe, now we're able to totally change the way we think about conflict and deal with it differently. And so by being aware of your lowest style, you can say to yourself, okay, I'm probably underusing the collaborating style. So I need to think about how at work, could I be collaborating more? Because overuse and underuse are our enemies here. We want to have a good balance of all of our conflict handling styles. And then, like I've mentioned before, if you took this test twice for thinking about your home life and thinking about your work life, you'd probably get very different answers. Or if you are a manager, you would probably get very different answers thinking about how you handle conflict with the people you manage versus with your own manager. So remember, it all matters the context that we're within. And so, like I mentioned before, we all have all 5 conflict modes available to us at all times. We just tend to revert to those 1 or 2 styles that are our main ones and that are our habits. And so we have to think about how we can work to apply a different conflict strategy, because it's not good when, or the best way to describe it is that undesirable situations in the workplace develop when a conflict strategy is used too little or too much and doesn't match the situation. And so, like I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of factors at play that come in when we're choosing a conflict style: the value of the conflict, the consequences, and the timeline. And so, like I said, if your relationship is what's most important to you, you need to preserve it, then you're probably going to want to accommodate or avoid that conflict. If the outcome is what's most important to you, think about, like I mentioned, how safety is a potential outcome earlier, then competing is probably going to be your most your best choice in style. And then if you really care about the relationship and the outcome, you can't pick one over the other, then you're going to need to rely on something like collaborating or compromising. And then the opposite is true. If you're willing to sacrifice the relationship and perhaps come off as a little stubborn, then you can compete. If you're willing to sacrifice your outcome, accommodate or compromise. If you're not willing to sacrifice that, either you need to avoid or collaborate. And of course, time. If you do not have a lot of time, you can avoid the issue, you can compete to get it done quickly, or you can accommodate to let them get it done quickly. If you have the time and this issue is important enough to you, you can collaborate or you can compromise. And so considering those three things, your relationship, the importance of the outcome, and the timeline, the matrix of how all those comes together tells us which conflict style we should rely on. And so I wanted to throw this in just because among all of us, we know what it's like to work for a PI and how that relationship can impact the way we handle conflict. And so I read a really great article from a woman who professionally advises graduate students, and she talked a lot about how many of them, can't believe it, have issues with their relationship with their advisor. That's shocking, right? And so in her work with those students, she found that there were mostly two kinds of PIs or managers that these students worked for. They either found the PI to be hands-off, busy, they never have time to meet with you and mentor you, or they were a micromanager who questioned every detail of your project and your work every single day. And the funny thing is, we can handle conflict with both of those types of managers by using the same strategies. So I just want to talk through a couple strategies in our last few minutes together. So if you're having conflict with your supervisor, whether they are ignoring you or whether they are micromanaging you, the first thing we have to do is understand your supervisor's expectations, because expectations that are not set are expectations that will never be met. And so once again, if I don't understand what my supervisor wants from me, how am I supposed to please them? And so the biggest issue is if we are not asking our supervisors explicitly what they want from us. And so the best thing I can think of is, it's like, are we going to have an in-person meeting to go over the progress of my project? Or would you like me to update you via email? Would you like me to send that to you once a week? Would you like me to send that to you once a month? And you've got to corner them and pin them down and get them to commit to how they want it. Because now that they've set this expectation, you can meet the expectation. The next thing is that when you do get a meeting with those folks, set an agenda for every meeting. And the best way I can imagine this is a back and forth email thread where you're listing everything that you want to talk about. You know, hey, we have our meeting tomorrow. Here are my points that I need to go over. Feel free to add any in a reply email. And then you have it written for both of you to access. And if you set it ahead of time, you have time to prepare to talk about it. They have time to prepare to talk about it. The next thing is when you're in these meetings with your supervisor, you have to explain your problems clearly because they do not know the details of the work you're doing and they're busy. They have so many things on their mind. Like my supervisor and I, our team is the two of us. So I imagine that I'm what she thinks about like 80% of the day, right? Because I'm the center of the world. But that's not true. I am always shocked when we meet at how little she remembers about our meetings. And I adore her and we have a great working relationship, but she just has her whole own job to do. She doesn't have the time to remember everything I'm doing. And so I found that I have to talk through the problems really clearly so that she can understand them and give me good ideas to deal with them, or else, you know, she gives me these like off the wall ideas. I'm like, why am I doing this? You don't even know what's going on. So you've got to explain your problems clearly if you guys are going to troubleshoot together, because they don't remember what you talked about at the last meeting. Next, we have to come to meetings with proposals to solve our problems, because that's going to make them view you as very productive. And it also just sets the stage for a productive discussion when you have something to jump off with. And finally, after that meeting, send a follow-up with everything in writing that includes what you talked about and summarizing action items. And once again, this gets back to the first idea of expectations that aren't set are expectations that will not be met. And so if you have now this written email correspondence that describes everything we talked about and what we said we would do, well, now we just set really clear expectations. So you can't get mad at me for not meeting them because we outlined them here. And so I imagine that same email chain where you set the agenda is also a follow-up of here's everything we talked about. Here's what we'll both be doing to advance this project. Thanks. See you at the next meeting, that kind of thing. So things to remember about conflict is that your one conflict style doesn't fit all situations. You have to adapt your style to fit the unique situation. I threw in assume good intent just because a lot of conflict deals with, we tell ourselves a story that somebody was trying to be malicious and they're out to get us, but the truth is it's often not like that. And if we assume that everybody else had good intent in what they did, it makes you a lot happier. And of course, life goes on tomorrow and your reputation lasts forever. So make sure that when you're in a conflict, you don't say something you'll regret because you cannot take it back. And so that's all from me. Thank you so much for your time. I'd love to hang out a little bit and talk about conflict, or, you know, I understand if y'all have to head off to your next meeting or your next class, but thank you. The pleasure's been all mine.
Any questions on Zoom?
It's just one person.
All right. Well, thank you
Main
guys.
question. I'm sorry, I do have
Yeah,
a
go ahead,
question. Do we just email you to find the handouts for this? Because I missed them on the way by because I'm working.
Totally.
Yep.
Shoot me an email and I'll send them to you right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. If you have pizzas over there, take some with you.
Don't forget to sign
And sign up. Yes. I think